mirror the communities. Therefore, it is vital that we all work together, the Bureau and the public, to combat this threat. I am honored to speak on behalf of the Bureau staff nationwide who are working the front lines tirelessly to mitigate the spread of this virus, as well as carrying on our very important mission. This is challenging, but it is vital to the safety and security of the public, our staff, and the inmates entrusted to our care. Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Jordan, and members of the subcommittee, this concludes my statement.
Thank you. Mr. Washington.
Good morning, Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Jordan, distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the United States Marshals Service. As my statement for the record reflects, the Marshals Service has an array of critical law enforcement missions, all of which we have continued to accomplish despite the challenges presented this year. My complete statement is available to you all, so I just want to briefly highlight two current areas of operation that reflect our diversity and importance as a law enforcement entity. First, not many people realize that in addition to our core missions of apprehending fugitives, transporting and housing prisoners, protecting the judicial process, and running the federal witness security program, we are also responsible for the Strategic National Stockpile Security Operations Program. Enhanced after 9/11, the National Stockpile fills an important need to have pharmaceuticals and other medical materials available for quick dissemination to the American people in times of national need, such as a man-made or natural disaster or a pandemic. The Marshals provide a variety of security controls for the stockpile, including storage and transportation of medical materials. I'm very pleased to report that our deputies are already working hand in hand with Operation Warp Speed to provide security for COVID-19 vaccines from the facilities where they are manufactured to distribution sites. We have teams of highly trained Marshals Service deputies who are executing this mission, and this demonstrates yet another way this agency provides for the safety and security of our nation's citizens. The second area I want to highlight relates to critically missing children. While we are recognized as the preeminent agency for locating and apprehending fugitives, we have found an equally important application for our people-finding skills. In 2015, members of this subcommittee gave the Marshals Service an added statutory authority as part of the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act. This authority enhanced our ability to use our resources to assist federal, state, and local law enforcement entities with the recovery of missing, endangered, and abducted children. Previously, we could only help find critically missing children when there was a connection to a fugitive or a sex offender investigation. Under this new authority, we established a missing child unit in 2016, and ever since, we have been partnering with our federal, state, and local authorities to recover missing children, many of whom are older runaways who are at risk, a very high risk of child sex trafficking, child exploitation, sexual abuse, and physical abuse. Since August alone, this agency's missing child unit has conducted 6 operations in districts around the country aimed at locating and recovering local missing children. The results speak for themselves. In these 6 operations, we recovered or located 181 children, 22 of which were known victims of sex trafficking. Now, beneath those numbers are real people. A few weeks ago, the foster parents of a child we recovered in New Orleans sent me this email, and it reads, "Dear Director Washington, thank you for saving our foster son. When 13-year-old Malik was abducted in New Orleans in mid-October, we were put in touch with your missing children's unit team here. Their coordinated efforts, calm energy, vigilant search tactics, and quick communication provided both relief and results. They stayed in touch with us at every turn, giving us hope when we had little. We cannot thank you enough for the great work your team down here does. If we can impress upon you anything, it is that this program should continue to be funded and provided resources. Without these efforts, we fear where our son may be today. Thank you again for the commitment you have instilled in your NOLA team. We are forever grateful. Best, Chelsea and Eric Nelson. Committee members, these two mission areas I have highlighted demonstrates this agency's diverse missions and commitment to public safety. I thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to answering your questions or any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Again, let me thank both of the witnesses for being here today and for your service. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter two documents into the record, one from the Sentencing Project and the other one from the American Federation of Government Employees. Thank you. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions, and I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. The Justice Department's Inspector General has reported that the Federal Correction Complex in Oakdale, Louisiana, failed to isolate or quarantine prisoners who were exposed or who tested positive to COVID-19. The report found that some inmates who had tested positive were left in their housing units for up to 6 days without being isolated. In the BOP's COVID-19 pandemic response plan, the BOP requires that a person who tests positive for COVID-19 be immediately placed under medical isolation. So I would like to ask Mr. Carvajal, what is your response to this, and why are COVID-positive prisoners not immediately isolated from the general population in all federal facilities?
Thank you, Chairwoman Bass. They are, and we do have procedures. They're good procedures when they're followed. In a nutshell, we had some leadership issues there. We sent an outside team in. Attorney General Barr actually sent a couple of his staff over. We sent a review team. Our regional director had some concerns about the procedures not being enforced or followed. In essence, without getting into details, I removed the leadership.
Okay,
the
good.
warden was removed from his position.
Good. Okay, I appreciate that. So in your facilities, are inmates and staff provided with masks, gloves, and the ability to practice good hygiene?
Chairwoman Bass, that is absolutely correct. They are. We do have the same challenge that everyone else, I believe, in the country and the world does, is that people have a personal accountability here also. We have to enforce the rules, but people have to make a conscious effort to follow the rules and procedures. They're in place for a reason. We have been in lockstep with CDC guidance from day one. It's well published. There's links. I've done informational messages. We have COVID review compliance teams, unannounced. Prior to me being the director, an unannounced visit in a federal correctional institution was unheard of. We have reviewed almost 100% of our facilities. That doesn't include outside stakeholders coming in. So it's a matter of enforcement, and it's a matter of people following the rules, both inmates and staff.
So we want to ask you about staff being provided access to testing, and I mentioned my visit to Terminal Island, and I did appreciate they were very open, and they did not raise the issue, but I am. And so it made no sense at all to me. It was wonderful that the inmates were tested and tested regularly, but the inmates are there. The staff come and go every day, and the staff had no access to testing. So has this been remedied in not just that facility, but throughout?
Yes, it has, Chairwoman Bass. I do recall your visit over there. I don't remember the particular the date or the time. I will tell you that early on, as with the rest of the world and the country, testing resources were unavailable.
Right. It's not picking you up.
Yes,
voice.
yes, ma'am,
There
it
you
was
go.
on. Okay, testing resources, as they have become available, we have gained access to them. If I remember correctly, in California, we partnered with a local community public health care. We've partnered with other entities. The union has helped us at times gain resources. And now I'm happy to say that we have a contract, a high volume testing contract. I'd also like to mention, Chairwoman Bass, that we can offer the testing. In many places we've offered availability 100% testing. People don't want to take it. We can't make them.
People meaning who? The
People
staff?
as in staff. It's
They don't wanna
voluntary.
take it?
It's voluntary. I'll give you an example. At Forest City, we
Actually,
offered.
I'm going to run out of time.
Yes,
so
ma'am.
Thank you. Let me ask Mr. Washington. We have heard accounts of people in Marshals custody being moved across state and county lines and placed into local jails with no information on their transfer paperwork about whether they have been tested for COVID or not. Could you
Yeah,
respond to that?
Chairman Bass, I have not heard that particular complaint. I can say that the good men and women of the United States Marshals Service are very interested in making sure that our inmates are healthy and safe and that
Are
the
they
constitutional
tested
rights.
before they're transferred, and are the people, the staff?
Yes,
tested?
we are testing for example, all of our inmates that go off to the BOP facilities are being tested, or at least a large portion of them are, and we have authorized funding for all state institutions in which our prisoners are housed.
Are you aware of the breakouts that have taken place from prisoners being transferred? Now, I don't know, maybe you have
I
rectified it.
have, yes, ma'am. I have, of course, seen the media reports and things of that sort, and we also know when there is an issue inside of a particular
Are the
facility.
media reports accurate?
Generally, so-so.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired. Representative Shabbat?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing today. And I want to thank Director Washington and Director Carvajal for appearing this morning. And thank you both for your service to our country and to your respective agencies. This year has been particularly difficult for everyone, everywhere, due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. We've all had to stay home, socially distance, and
Stephen.
otherwise, sure, sorry, and otherwise follow CDC guidelines to help reduce the spread of this deadly virus. Similarly, you've had great challenges and a task to protect both your staff and the spreading populations that you serve, and make sure that they don't contract both your employees as well as the inmates this deadly virus. Now, in the ranking member's opening statement, Mr. Jordan mentioned that Democratic leadership in this committee sent a letter to the Attorney General, Mr. Barr, and I'm sure that you all were aware of this, urging you to use every tool at your disposal to release as many prisoners as possible. Now, that would be completely irresponsible, as I think most people would agree, and would put the public directly at risk. Now, Director, how do you take into consideration the seriousness of the inmate's crime, for example, and the risk of recidivism before sending someone into home confinement, for example? What do you look at when you're making those types of determinations?
Congressman, there are several criteria. The ones particular that would refer to what you're talking about, the seriousness of crime, is there's 4 criteria that were listed that we follow that we don't deviate from. The primary offense cannot be a violence, a sex offense, terrorism, or they can't have a detainer. There's numerous other criteria, I can certainly list them if you like, that are somewhat discretionary. But we absolutely take into consideration public safety. In fact, the Attorney General's guidance to me in 2 separate memorandums stated that to maximize the use of this authority, but that we absolutely have a responsibility not to release and overburden the community. So we take into consideration public health and public safety. I assure you that anyone that is eligible under that criteria has been reviewed and, if appropriate, transferred to community custody, just as we were directed.
Thank you. What tools does the Bureau use to monitor inmates after they're released into home confinement?
Congressman, we, under normal circumstances, I think everyone needs to understand that home confinement in and of itself is a transitional program. It's set up for inmates at the end of their sentence, 6 months or 10% of their sentence, to transition into community. The CARES Act has us looking at inmates who otherwise may not even meet that criteria. So you're talking about long-term placement in a community. We didn't have the resources. We expanded it. 94% of the inmates on home confinement are monitored through contracts. Everybody needs to understand that those contract staff that monitor these inmates, they use GPS, electronic monitoring, things like that. These are not law enforcement personnel. We don't have the staff to monitor them. We contract out. 94% of them are monitored by contract staff We do contracts, but they're not law enforcement. They simply keep track of and check on these people. The other 6% are monitored by United States Probation Office and the federal location monitoring.
Thank you. And finally, I've got about a minute left, so let me touch on something else. I've been a longtime supporter and advocate for prison industries. When we have these folks confined for a period of time, the vast majority of them are going to get out at some point. We would prefer the lowest recidivism as possible. We don't want them to go out and commit more crimes. We know many will, unfortunately. But those that have been involved in getting a skill or something they can put to work in the private sector at some point probably have a better chance of not going out committing more crime. So how has COVID and the restrictions and how has that impacted the prison industry's program?
Congressman, it absolutely has impacted prison industries. We know that 24% less likely to recidivate if they worked in prison industries, 14% more likely to have a job when they get out if they worked in federal prison industries. It's actually our #1 evidence-based recidivism reducing program, but it has been impacted like all other organizations. We are down about 2,000 workers. We generally employ about 10,000 inmates in federal prison industries. There's always a waiting list. We're down to about 8,000. Unicor was projected to have a $27 million earnings last year because our factories were doing well under the First Step Act. We ended up we closed the year with a $3 million deficit. So we have to get that back on track so that we continue to give people the opportunity to get those jobs out there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Representative Jackson Lee.
Thank you for yielding. Good morning, and thank you to the Director for your service to the country and to Head of the U.S. Marshals as well. My time is very short. I will try to shorten my questions, go directly to you, U.S. Marshal. The chairwoman asked this question that I'd like to follow up, and that is that those that you are able to secure, and let me also acknowledge your work with finding children and congratulate your men and women in that service, come from many different facilities. And there has never been a question of or a source of information about the COVID-19 protocols or the status of these individuals coming from facilities that do not follow the Bureau of Prison protocol in testing. Do you have the data of all the people you have in custody and whether or not they've been tested, whether or not their facilities are following COVID-19 facility protocols, and also whether or not you've had any to die from COVID-19 in your custody? You just quickly answer those questions. I need to move to the Director, please.
Thank you, Chairmanwoman Jackson Lee. Yes, we have some data. The difficulty we have, of course, is that we have some 800 facilities because as Chairwoman Bass indicated, of the 2 million prisoners in the United States, we have 63,000 spread out over 800 facilities. So it has been somewhat of a difficult exercise to make sure that we have consistent, accurate data. The data that we've been able to accumulate is not uniformly reported, and it's not reported at the same time. But we do have some data in terms of the numbers that have tested positive and deaths and those that are on ventilators and in hospitals and things of that sort.
So let me ask you, let me make this request, and I think it's been made by members of Congress before, House and Senate. To my official request is that you find the capacity for collecting that data and submitting it to this committee, particularly as much as you can garner, particularly those hospitalized and any that have died, and whatever authority you have to the facilities, because we pay those facilities, to send notice to them that you want them to provide testing protocols or others to those that you have that are under your federal custody, meaning that you are getting from them. And I'd like to hopefully have you look into that, please, Mr. Washington, and see how much data you can provide us with.
I'll look into it, Representative.
Those individuals may go back into society and family members, et cetera, and that's what we're trying to stop, is that extensive community spread. Thank you very much for your service.
Thank you, Madam.
Let me ask, Director, thank you again. As you well know, the ACLU filed a lawsuit in October 27th regarding the handling of COVID-19 at federal facility in Butner, North Carolina, dealing with the complaint alleges that BOP has not reconfigured housing units to allow for social distancing. And during a hearing, Director, in the Senate Judiciary Committee, you committed to new efforts by the Bureau to create alternate living. Let me ask you what progress you have made in dealing with social distancing. Let me also ask you whether or not you have continued the waiver of the co-payment for incarcerated persons. That makes it very difficult for them. And then my other question is to raise the question of why we're allowing the mindset for individuals who are on the front lines to deny or reject testing. And that means, I know there are unions inside, I want to respect, I'm not sure whether they're representing individuals, I'd like to question them, I'm a strong supporter of their work ethic, but I don't think you can come here and say to us that they don't want to get tested. I'm going to be asking people to get vaccinated, and I know that's going to be a challenge, but they don't want to get tested? I think you need to come up with, I'd like to hear your response of how you can more effectively deal with making sure that all of your staff are effectively tested, which I think is extremely important. If you'd share in this short amount of time your best answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, we are still waiving the copay for COVID-related illness. We have expanded the use because our population is lower. Two things we've done in those areas that were challenging. The prisons aren't made for social distancing, as you're well aware. They're completely the opposite. So we did have challenges. With the reduction in our population, we've been able to spread people out. We actually put target population levels on our most vulnerable facilities so they're at about 50% capacity. We also used some of the COVID funding to purchase tents and things of that nature. We have temporary housing. We borrowed tents from the military at one point till we were able to get some to distance people out and provide alternative living areas. We've made use of every available space we can to convert for housing so that we can get that in place. Again, prisons aren't necessarily built for that. The last portion of your question about staff testing, I can't mandate somebody to take a test, Congresswoman. If I could, I'd be doing it already.
Well, let me, my time is up, but let me indicate that your individuals are on the front line. Maybe we need to help you with that. I understand civil liberties, civil rights, the Constitution, but you're talking about individuals coming in contact with incarcerated persons who can't walk away, can't get out. And that means they are endangering themselves, their families at home. Can you just ask a question of the numbers of your men and women who may have lost their life to COVID-19? Do you have a number on that?
When you say my men and women, are you
Talking
referring to
about-
inmates or staff?
Staff.
145 inmates and 3 staff. 2 staff that were confirmed, 1 that was listed posthumously as being COVID positive, but the cause of death was not listed as that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative
I yield back. Thank you.
Gilmore? Representative.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both to our witnesses for being here. Mr. Carvajal, I know this is a difficult time, but I am, back when I was a judge and when I was paying close attention to felony facilities, federal and state, we had a problem called AIDS, and I'm glad to see the majority's interest. Now, I was shocked how little regard people had in Congress with regard to AIDS spreading through federal prisons. So it looks like there's more of an appropriate interest now, even though that was much more of a deadly disease. Do you have any idea what the percentage, the mortality rate is of those who are positive with COVID-19 within the prison system?
Congressman, that's somewhat of a difficult question to ask because we have so many moving pieces, releases and everything. Even my medical experts are challenged with that. Here's what I'll tell you, the way we look at this is that we have a lot of positive cases, as does everyone. The majority of those cases early on were asymptomatic. That's why the testing is so important, and the mass testing is we've been able to identify pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic cases and utilize that to help us mitigate the spread of this virus. So we've been able to flatten that curve, as everyone likes to say, And although our deaths were a higher rate early on, we haven't had as many on ventilators, which is a key. It averages about 6 to 8 here lately, even with the last spike. And more importantly, at one point we had over 145, 150 inmates in a hospital at one time. That stays at about 18 to 20, depending on these spikes. But less people are dying now from this disease. And even though our numbers show high positive rates, at least 50% at this point right now are asymptomatic, and they aren't actively sick. I know they're sick with a virus. That's why we want to isolate them and quarantine them, but we're able to do that better with testing.
And I would encourage your physicians, when you talk about people being put on ventilators, Dr. Bartlett from Midland has done some great research in the use of steroid nebulizers to protect the alveoli from becoming mush, because once that happens, even when you put them on ventilators, it doesn't seem to be helpful. Do you know approximately what percentage of the prison population are in the United States illegally?
Congressman, off my head, I remember the numbers about 15% non-U.S. citizens. I don't know the exact number that were illegal reentry, but I do know that we have approximately 15% non-U.S. citizens.
Wasn't it higher than that at one time?
I believe so, Congressman. I don't recall.
Because I understood that number, that percentage had been reduced because of the COVID crackdown on the border. Have you seen that yourself?
Congressman, I don't want to misspeak. I would have to ask somebody for that data. I don't have it.
Would you
readily
mind
available.
getting that and
Yes, I
explain
will.
that? Thank you. Now, from my experience during the days as a judge, it seemed that 70+% of those incarcerated had either an alcohol or drug problem, alcoholics, drug addicts. Do you have any idea what percentage you're looking at in our federal prison system?
Again, Congressman, I don't know the exact percentages. I will tell you that we do have lots of programming tailored towards alcohol and drug problems and offenses treatment programs. A lot of our programs are geared towards that. But I don't know the exact percentage.
Have those programs been impacted by COVID, their ability to have the regular meetings?
Absolutely. We have been impacted by COVID just like everyone else. We did early on. Obviously, we suspended programming at some point. We have since resumed. We're probably it varies depending on the infection at the facility, but I'd like to say we're at 50, 60, 70% programming back to normal. We found creative ways, just as the school systems have, to resume programming.
Right, and we have military inmates confined in federal facilities using the program called Federal Transfer. Has that been impacted by COVID?
A quick answer, you're out of time.
Yeah.
Congressman, I don't know particularly about the military, but again, our entire system has been impacted.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative McBath?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for shedding some light on these very important issues this morning. As we continue to grapple with COVID-19, case after case has shown us just how difficult it is to contain this virus. Everyone must do their part to protect one another, and we've seen that a single unsafe environment or event has ripple effects throughout our communities, and employees especially have a responsibility to provide safety measures for their workers, because if they don't, lives are definitely on the line. No one knows this more than the family of Robin Grubbs. Robin was an Army veteran and a caseworker at a BOP facility in Atlanta. I represent Georgia. In March, she was promoted to a new role where she would be helping those who had completed their sentences to return to their families and to their communities. And she would be helping them get a brand new start. But despite her promotion, Robin never got to start her new job or move to a new office in another building. Instead, she was kept for an additional month in her old role in her old office, located in an area that BOP started using to house those who were infected or exposed to COVID-19. According to coworkers, Robin tried to buy her own masks while she still waited for her office move and for BOP to provide her sufficient PPE. Robin's parents knew that she was at risk. They themselves had recently dropped off a care package with cough suppressants, medicine, and hand sanitizer to her. Sadly, Robin was found dead in her home. She posthumously tested positive for COVID-19. And her father says that he was told a toxology report did not reveal any alternative causes of her death other than COVID-19. And according to a news report in April, and I quote, a BOP spokesperson said that her official cause of death has not yet been determined as her autopsy is not yet complete, end quote. But since then, according to later reporting, a spokesperson for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation said an autopsy was not performed on Robin because she tested positive for COVID-19, which was listed as the probable cause of death. As of today, BOP does not list any COVID-19 staff deaths at the facility where Robin worked. In short, BOP has not acknowledged that Robin Grubbs likely died of COVID-19. And Director Carvajal, does BOP disagree with the determination that COVID-19 was Robin's possible cause of death? And if so, what evidence does it rely on to make that decision?
Congresswoman, what happened to Robin Grubbs, as with anyone who dies, for that matter, is sad. I don't know that we've ever disagreed with anything. I don't know where you're getting your information. I'm not a medical expert, nor do I write the autopsy reports, and we're simply saying what we are given. That last piece of information you said from the Georgia Bureau, I don't have that information. We've never disputed or debated. We just simply call it like we see it. The paperwork we were given did not determine a cause of death. We're not disputing it. I would not do that. Robin Grubbs was one of our staff.
Well, and thank you for that answer. But also, too, the Board of Prisons website, we've just had a chance to look at, doesn't actually show her death. It shows the death of 2 staff members. And so are you planning on updating the website to identify the fact that Robin did actually die, and so there was an inmate death?
You are correct, Congresswoman. Our website lists 2. Again, I don't know all the specifics or the legalities or whatever reason that is, but I will tell you that no one in the Bureau of Prisons is disputing whatever the doctor says that young lady passed away from. Our website, we get criticized regardless of what we put it out there. I will have you know that staff criticized us for acknowledging her death at all. Early on, we were actually scrutinized because we wanted to tell people about this. There's been nobody trying to hide anything here. Regardless of what we put on that website, somebody's not going to like the information. We are not disputing. It is a sad situation, and it bothers me that I'm even talking about this. Robin Grubbs is one of my staff.
Sir, thank you so much. So in spite of what anyone thinks, would you be willing to update the website to make sure that you're identifying that an inmate actually died within the care of the Board of Prisons?
Congresswoman, again, I will speak to whatever reason that website is not updated. I follow the advice of people. There's reasons we do that. I will get back with you, I assure you, and I will address that issue of our staff member passing away.
Okay, thank you very much, and I appreciate any updates that you can provide the committee going forward. I'd like to give the balance of my time to Chairwoman Bass.
I think you're out of time. Let me just say quickly that no one on either side of the aisle is calling for the indiscriminate release of prisoners. But who we are concerned about are prisoners that might be medically compromised, including prisoners with terminal illnesses. Why would they be confined now? Prisoners who are elderly, illnesses that put them at risk for COVID, respiratory, or heart conditions, and people who are in pretrial detention who are not a risk to the public safety. The other issue is that the majority of the inmates come from communities that are already disproportionately impacted. So we want to make sure that they are tested and medically cleared before they release. This protects the inmates, the prison staff, and the general public. Representative Klein.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. This has certainly been a challenging year for our nation, and the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic have been felt by every American and institution. Much like everything else in today's world, our criminal justice system has had to adapt in order to ensure justice is served, no matter the circumstances we're facing. As members of this committee, we must continue to seek improvements to our justice system and guarantee victims of crime and their families are never robbed of justice. At the same time, we must ensure that there is fairness and transparency throughout our criminal justice system. I've appreciated hearing from our witnesses today and getting their insight on how the pandemic has affected their agencies and what must be done to ensure that our justice system continues to operate safely and in the best interest of the American public. Director Washington, I want to first commend the U.S. Marshals Service for their tremendous work in rescuing 33 children during an operation last month in Virginia that included parts of my district. Protecting our nation's children from predators has been a top priority for me. Can you expand on your earlier remarks about how the pandemic has impacted the Marshals' work in pursuing predators and rescuing children who are being exploited and trafficked?
Yes, thank you for the question, Congressman Klein. First, let me thank you for House Resolution 5706 and the danger pay for U.S. Marshals Act. That's very meaningful for my agency. It's something that we need. The pandemic has taken its toll all over the country, as you well know. Inside of our agency, we've had to adjust like anyone else has done. In terms of the number of fugitives, as an example, on any given year, the United States Marshals Service will arrest 100,000 of the nation's worst criminals on any given year. That number is going to be about 80,000 this year, as an example. So we will see the impact in terms of workload and things of that sort. But it's also impacted just the way we look and feel about each other. For example, we took note, of course, as everyone in the country did, of the death of George Floyd and what happened there. And so we've had the opportunity to have discussions about racial inequality and use of force and things of that sort. That's the good side of it. On the other side of it, workload has been tremendously impacted. Although we have people who are at home, we have deputies that have to go to court every day, and that has caused a tremendous strain on those deputies and their families. In terms of courts, we continue to ensure that the rule of law functions as it should in this country. I'll be honest with you, we need staff. I think you probably have heard that before. We've asked for 280 additional Deputy United States Marshal positions in the FY21 budget. That's not something that we take lightly when we make those kind of requests. It is vital for us to do whatever we can to increase those kinds of resources so we can get back to do even more fugitive operations and even more child rescues.
And let me follow up on that. Regarding recruiting, the U.S. Marshals carry out operations not only here in the U.S. but overseas in dangerous locations. However, unlike your DOJ counterparts at the FBI and DEA, the U.S. Marshals Service is not eligible for danger pay, as you mentioned. This is a serious problem, and I appreciate your recognition of the legislation that has been introduced on a bipartisan basis by members of this committee. Can you talk about the impact on recruitment and if these men and women are serving overseas in dangerous conditions, putting themselves in harm's way, shouldn't they also be able to receive danger pay? And how does that lack of danger pay impact your ability to recruit the best and brightest?
Yes, the pandemic has shown a light on that issue. But let me back up just a little bit. So, as you indicated, the FBI and the DEA have those authorities to pay danger pay to their agents. We do not, to our Deputy U.S. Marshals, who do extraordinarily dangerous work in countries like Mexico, where we're going after a drug trafficker and trying to bring them back to the United States, where we're actually working with authorities inside the country at levels that I don't think the other agencies do. In fact, we have relationships in those countries that give us a little bit of a leg up. But we have not only agents, Deputy U.S. Marshals, we have their families as well. So this year, as an example, we had to, of course, remove people from those 4 foreign field offices because of the pandemic, and then we had to send them back, right? So we're sending them back into harm's way, and they can look across the table in Mexico City, as an example, and sit there next to a DEA agent or an FBI agent, and recognize that even though they may be the same grade level, they're not getting the same kind of compensation for work that is equally as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than what those other agents are doing. So it's just something that we need to kind of level out and make sure that that our officers are fairly treated.
Thank you. Representative Deutsch.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair, and Director Carvalho, Director Washington, thank you for your service to our country. Prisoners confined in BOP facilities have two options to seek additional protection over the pandemic. We've talked about this. We've talked about seeking the remainder of their sentence in home confinement or compassionate release. Home confinement is a determination made solely by the BOP, and Director Carvalho, you've talked about the consideration of public safety, something that all of us acknowledge needs to be the primary driver here. But then we get to the criteria that are used to determine whether a person is eligible to serve the remainder in their home confinement. And the question I have for you, just for some context, on May 13th, the former chair of President Trump's campaign, Paul Manafort, was transferred to home confinement due to COVID-19 fears, and he had served far less than half of his 7-year sentence. On May 20th, President Trump's former lawyer, Michael Cohen, qualified for home confinement. He was released from BOP custody, and both Paul Manafort and Michael Cohen were released due to concerns of the pandemic in prisons. These are valid concerns. And since May of this year, only about 1.8% of prisoners in BOP have been moved to complete their sentence in home confinement. Most have been denied a transfer. So my question, Director Carvalho, for you is how many prisoners have been approved by the Bureau of Prisons for transfer to home confinement? Do you have that number?
Congressman, I believe that if I'm understanding your question correctly, it's 18,000, over 18,000 that we've placed in home confinement since the passage of the CARES Act.
And how did, if you know, how did Paul Manafort and Michael Cohen qualify to be transferred to home confinement? Do you know the analysis that was used in those cases?
Congressman, what I can tell you is anyone that's been placed on home confinement, regardless of who they are, met the criteria outlined by the CARES Act and specifically the criteria were given by the Attorney General. He issued 2 separate memorandums to me with guidance on there. I don't personally review these. There's a reason I don't get involved. They're done at the local level. When there's anything discretionary to be reviewed outside of the criteria, it rises to a committee at the headquarters level that is higher level subject matter experts. And everything is they either meet the criteria or they don't. There is some discretion on some of that criteria.
Well, let me just follow up for a second. I appreciate that. I'm not sure that I understand what the higher level analysis or the expertise is required. But let me just talk about 2 other cases, not Paul Manafort or Michael Cohen. In a letter requesting compassionate release from Marie Neba, who was confined at the Federal Medical Center Carswell, there was a description to the judge that she had not received medication for treating her breast cancer since March 5th of this year. She described how the lockdown of the facility due to COVID-19 pandemic had caused medical care at the facility to deteriorate. Her condition worsened. She was concerned about the spread of COVID-19. She was not released and ultimately passed away from COVID. And in a letter requesting compassionate release, W. Youngberg, who was confined at the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, described to the judge how there were 30 cases of COVID in 3 different buildings. The facility was on lockdown, and Mr. Youngberg was housed in a 24-hour medical care unit, actively sought help from the warden and the judge to protect himself from the spreading virus. And ultimately, in that case, unfortunately, he passed as well. Do you know, Director Carvalho, how many prisoners over the age of 65 and medically vulnerable have been transferred to home confinement? Is that all of the 18,000 that you referenced?
Congressman, I don't have those exact numbers. I will have to follow up with you. I will tell you there is a difference between the compassionate release process. You're talking about releasing someone, essentially undoing or reducing a sentence imposed by a criminal court.
I understand. No, I understand.
The home confinement process is different.
Director Carville, I understand. I do understand the difference well. What I don't understand is the seeming disparity in treatment that permitted two individuals who may have had underlying conditions, but were released to home confinement with two individuals who clearly had underlying challenges and wound up dying of COVID-19. A federal judge ordered the Bureau of Prisons to review medically vulnerable prisoners at Elkton in Ohio, asked for a list of prisoners aged 65 and those who were medically vulnerable. And the Bureau responded to a judge that there were 837, but only 5 would be transferred to home confinement. All I ask, Director Carvajal, is that we go back and analyze fully the steps that we can take to provide the same protections for these inmates who are not violent as the protections that were provided to these two individuals who happened coincidentally to have close relationships with the President of the United States. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Leska.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first of all, I want to say thank you to both of you for your service to our country and also to your employees. They have a difficult job, very dangerous job, and I appreciate them, and I believe the majority of Americans appreciate their hard work. I'm going to read a letter dated March 30th, 2020, and it was a letter from Chairman Nadler and Chairwoman Bass to the Attorney General Barr. And it's on page 4, and I'm going to go into page 5. And it says, your memorandum, meaning Attorney General Barr's memorandum, specifies that priority should be given to inmates in low and minimum security facilities, and that serious offenses should weigh more heavily against consideration for home detention. I think that's reasonable. These limitations, unfortunately, beg the question of what you do with individuals who are at high risk for contracting COVID-19, who are not in lower minimum security facilities, who have been convicted of serious offenses or have high pattern risk scores. We urge you to consider that even individuals in these categories should be assessed for release because they may be elderly or particularly vulnerable. Pregnant prisoners in all circumstances should be released to home confinement forthwith. We further urge you to assess the risk of contracting COVID-19 of every individual in BOP custody, regardless of the type of institution in which they are housed, the seriousness of their offense, or the potential recidivism risk they may present. Well, I think that we can take reasonable measures, common sense measures of people that are low risk to the society, but I am concerned, I have to say, Madam Chairman and others, I'm very concerned if we're just encouraging the prisons to release even people convicted of serious offenses. And let me tell you why, and this isn't a person that was in federal prison, but this is an example. This was a rape. This man was indicted in rape of a woman last year and was released in April because of the coronavirus and is accused of then fatally shooting his accuser. I mean, this is the picture of the man. And to me, of course, we have to take reasonable measures to protect not only the inmates, but of course, your employees. But I certainly do not think that the majority of Americans, including myself, whether they're Republican, Independent, or Democrats, want dangerous criminals released into our communities. And so I just want to tell you that, but also with the 1 minute and 47 seconds left, do either one of you have anything that you would like to add that you haven't had the opportunity to talk about?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I just want to say that anyone that was eligible under the criteria we were issued with the direction of the CARES Act that met that criteria and was safe, met public safety factors, has been released from our custody. We take this very serious. We want to keep people safe regardless. Most people that aren't released is because they have committed a crime of violence or a sex offense or they have a detainer or an act of terrorism. And I think that it goes back to what you were saying, that we have a responsibility. A court processed them, a judge found them to come to our custody, and we take serious who we're going to release back. And again, I'd like to remind everyone that we are transferring people to home confinement. They are still in the custody of the Bureau of Prisons. Compassionate release is an actual reduction in sentence or release of that sentence that was imposed by a court. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back,
Representative Jeffries.
unless the marshal had something to
Oh.
say. Ms.
Well,
do
we're
you have
done.
anything?
Actually, you're out of
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for yielding and for your tremendous leadership in convening this hearing. I thank our two witnesses for their service to the country. Director Carvajal, COVID-19 is a serious disease, is that correct?
Yes, Congressman, it is.
And a potentially fatal disease in some instances, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And I think there are about 24,000 individuals in BOP custody who have tested positive for the virus, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And approximately 145 federal inmates have died as a result of COVID-19, is that true?
That is correct.
Those individuals who died in the Bureau of Prisons custody, is that right?
The 145, correct.
And at a hearing before the Senate in June, you stated that, quote, prisons by design are not made for social distancing. They are, on the opposite, made to contain people in one area. Is that correct in terms of that being your testimony?
Yes, sir, it is.
And I think you reiterated earlier today that prisons are not built for social distancing. Is that true?
That is correct.
And the public health experts have indicated that social distancing is an important tool to be used in combating this serious and deadly COVID-19 virus. Is that right?
That is correct.
So I think given the circumstances that the inmates and employees of the Bureau of Prisons find themselves in, as you've testified, it seems like the presumption at the Bureau of Prisons should be to utilize the tools available to it to allow inmates relief from this potentially deadly virus. Is that fair to say?
It is, Congressman, and that's what we're doing.
So part of my concern is that the tools that have been made available to you include both the emergency provisions and powers provided under the CARES Act, as well as the compassionate release provision that was a part of the First Step Act. Is that right?
Correct.
And in terms of the compassionate release provision, I guess during the COVID-19 pandemic, the federal courts have granted nearly 2,000 motions for compassionate release. Is that true?
That sounds about right.
Now, the Bureau of Prisons can also initiate a motion for compassionate release. Is that correct?
Correct.
And part of my concern is that, I guess during the first 3 months of the pandemic, the Bureau of Prisons approved approximately 0.1% of compassionate release requests. Is that right?
Yes, sir. Again, I don't know the exact numbers, but it was a low number.
In other words, 10,929 requests out of 10,940 requests were rejected. Does that sound right?
Again, Congressman, I don't have the exact numbers.
So you just testified earlier that we should utilize the tools available to us that have been made available to you on a bipartisan basis in both the CARES Act and the First Step Act to alleviate the pain, suffering, and death connected to the COVID-19 pandemic. But the numbers don't suggest that you're actually doing that. Can you explain why there's been such low utilization as it relates to compassionate release?
Yes, I can, Congressman. First of all, as I stated earlier, you're talking about reducing a sentence or reversing a sentence imposed by a judge in a court. That is not a process that should be rushed. We take into consider but public safety. we review everyone for home confinement because it's a quicker process to get them out. An inmate has the right and the ability to go straight to the courts. I also want to remind everyone that the Bureau of Prisons doesn't make the final determination of whether or not someone's approved for compassionate release. All we're doing is simply recommending to the judge. So there's a 30-day window, and then the inmate can go directly to a court. That's why the courts have released more. It's a lengthy process. There's a lot of vetting, verifying to go into that. So it's a very thorough process.
Thank you for that. I think the issue is that you've had at least 24 individuals who've died in prison waiting for a compassionate release request to even be reviewed, if not signed off on by the Bureau of Prisons. That seems to me inconsistent with the presumption that we should be doing all that we can to alleviate the pain and suffering and death connected to COVID-19 in the tight quarters of the federal penitentiary. And the last observation I'll make, as my time has expired, is that you've mentioned consistently this notion that we've got individuals who may have engaged in serious crimes and pose public safety risks. The example that we've been talking about, Marie Neba, is someone who was in prison on a nonviolent offense of Medicare fraud. And in too many of these instances, that's the same situation. That's a shame because a prison sentence should not be a death sentence. I yield back.
Representative Jordan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director Washington, has violent crime increased this year in major urban areas?
The data indicates it has increased.
Aggravated assaults up 14%, homicide rates up 53% in major urban areas. In that environment, should big cities be defunding their police? New York City is defunding their police $1 billion. Los Angeles, $150 million reduction in police force and police budget. Austin, Texas, $150 million. San Francisco, $120 million. Philadelphia, $33 million. Baltimore, $23 million. Portland, Oregon, $16 million. Does that make sense to you, Director Washington?
Not to me. As the head of the law enforcement agency that is charged with handling violent crime, and in fact, in many of those cities, of course, we've deployed deputy U.S. Marshals to participate on various task forces to address the increase in violent crime.
In that overall environment, the increase in violent crime, cities defunding their police department, should we be releasing more criminals early back into those neighborhoods?
I don't think we should, Congressman.
But that's exactly what Democrats want to do. And it's not just, as the chairwoman said earlier, it's not just those that you go through and make sure, Director Carvajal, that you go through and make sure that they're not going to be a harm to the community. That's not what they said in their letter. As Congresswoman Lesko just pointed out, when they sent the letter to Attorney General Barr back in March, they said, assess all prisoners for release, regardless of the type of institution in which they're housed. Here's the key part, regardless of the seriousness of their offense or the potential recidivism risk that they pose to the community. So they wanted everyone to get released in an environment where we already have a 53% increase in homicide rates, a 14% increase in aggravated assaults, and big city mayors and big city councils, all run by Democrats, are defunding the police department. That's exactly what they wanted to do. You think that makes sense, Director Washington?
Well, again, Congressman, from my agency's perspective, we've been very busy addressing violent crime in the United States. As you well know, we've initiated Operation Legend as a result of the death of young Legend Taliaferro in Kansas City, Missouri. 4-year-old in bed gets shot and killed is not a thing that we want to happen in the United States. So what we've done, of course, is participate in various cities around the country. Operation Legend continues. I just received the data yesterday on the 20th week of Operation Legend. And for example, in Chicago, we've arrested 1,000 folks who fit the categories of either homicide, sexual assault, robbery, and things of that sort.
Yeah, I actually want to, I forgot one thing. It's worse than I just described. They not only want to release criminals back into communities where there's already an elevated state of violent crime, where the police are being defunded, they not only want to release people early, regardless of the seriousness of their offense, they want the taxpayers to pay for it. I forgot about that. They introduced legislation that said, we want to pay states to do what I just described. Such a deal for the taxpayer. I mean, this is the part. No wonder you got. Think about the small business owner in Portland, for example. You got a small business owner in Portland who's paid all their local taxes, only to have their business in downtown Portland be destroyed this summer when the mob took over the streets. And now Democrats are saying, oh, now we want to use your federal tax dollars to put more criminals on the streets. Does that make any sense to you at all, Director Washington?
Well, Your Honor, Congressman, I'm not, of course, a politician. I just run a federal law enforcement agency. From a law enforcement perspective, that doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make sense. Oh, and to make, there's one other step. It gets better. There's one other thing. We just learned that 15% of the inmates in our Bureau of Prisons are illegal immigrants. Is that right, Director Carbajal?
Non-U.S. citizens.
Non-U.S. citizens, and the Democrats want them released as well. Regardless of the seriousness of their offense, they want taxpayer money to be used to pay the states to release illegal immigrants, regardless of their offense, back into communities where we've seen a 53% increase in violent crime and where those same cities are defunding their police. That might be the craziest thing I've ever heard, but that is exactly their policy. And frankly, Madam Chair, I would ask for unanimous consent to enter the letter you sent, along with Chairman Nadler, to the Attorney General, which spells out what I just described. With that, I yield back.
Representative Dean. For the record, the letter says assessed, not released. I don't know if anyone on either side of the aisle that calls for defunding the police, and I love the way the ranking member talks about my city. Representative Dean.
Madam Chair.
Again, regardless of the type of institution in which they are housed, the seriousness of their offense, or the potential recidivism risk that they may present. I didn't write that, you did. That's not Republican language, that's you and Chairman Nadler. So if you're now saying the seriousness of their offense is not in the letter, that you want to strike that out, that's one thing. But that's not what you wrote on March 30th, 2020.
We can debate the letter.
No, it's not debating the letter. That's what's in the letter.
I would pose that you are mischaracterizing it, and I will call on Representative Dean.
I'm reading your words.
Representative Dean.
I thank you, Madam Chair, and I do want to say, I thought this was a serious body here to talk about governing and protecting public health and protecting public safety, and not a campaign commercial. I thought the campaign was over, but sadly, we are seeing mischaracterization of other members' works very, very grotesquely. So, number one, I thank you both for the work that you do. I thank you for the teams that you have assembled and the extraordinary staff who puts their own lives and health at risk. What I would like to know more about is during COVID, for example, compliance with mask wearing among staff and among inmates. Are you able to get full compliance for simple mask wearing because you are challenged with confinement and closed spaces?
Thank you, Congresswoman. It is a tough, just like with anything, it's enforcement and accountability and expectations. We expect people to wear it. We expect from the leadership that it be enforced, and we respect and expect from everyone that they have personal accountability to follow the rules. We incorporated unannounced inspections. We welcome outside inspections, and if there's any doubt, just this week, I sent someone to verify because I had people complaining. I heard these complaints. They were concerning. We sent an unannounced team to an institution just for that reason.
And that's great because you are in the business of supervising and overseeing. So I would think you would have the tools in place to deal with, sadly, this pandemic and the need for these important measures. I, too, want to ask about the use of compassionate release. And so I want to make clear that when you testified that some 18,112 inmates were returned to home confinement, that is not compassionate release. From the records that we have seen, that I read about, only 11 people of nearly 11,000 folks in the first 3 months who had applied for compassionate release had received that. So I want to be really clear. When we talk about 18,000 people going to home confinement, they were going there anyway under the protocols as things were happening. They weren't as a result of COVID release. Am I correct?
Congresswoman, the passage of the CARES Act and COVID caused us to place a high number of people who would not ordinarily have been considered, at least at this point in time, for home confinement. You are correct, the compassionate release numbers are lower. As I explained earlier, that is a lengthy process. Under our policy and by the guidelines of statute, an inmate has to be shown extraordinary and compelling circumstances. That's not something we do in a day or two.
I heard that answer. I appreciate that. And the meeting of the balancing of the urgency of COVID against the assessment of whether a person is appropriate for compassionate release. But some of those criteria were met in the cases that have been identified, and yet those folks were not released. Of the 18,000 who went to home confinement, can you break down that number for us? How many were headed to home confinement anyway? How many are as a result of your reassessment from COVID?
I don't have the exact numbers in front of me. They change.
That?
I will tell you, as of right now, of the there's approximately 8,000 on home confinement currently. Right now, about 50 or 60% of those are CARES Act, specific to the CARES Act, that would not have ordinarily been in home confinement at this point. I'm not saying they weren't ever going to be eligible.
I'm worried about my time, sorry, to try to keep it tight. What I would like to ask you is if you provide the chairwoman and the ranking member data about those who've been released for compassionate care. I'm hoping there's well more than 11 that we have learned about. That seems incredibly sad. And also the breakdown of the 18,000 and now 8,000 who are in home confinement. I appreciate all of that. In terms of, I'm going to have no time, darn it. I apologize.
You can continue.
I thank you. What I would like to ask about and shift to is something I've been very concerned about, which is the use of shackling of pregnant women while in confinement. Can you speak, both of you, speak to the use of shackles on pregnant women in your agencies?
Thank you, Director. We don't do it. We have procedures in place. We amended our policy. It has happened one time since the passage of the First Step Act. It was documented. It was a mistake for all practical purposes. The female was identified as being pregnant, and the same day, the person didn't have time to enter it. We have good procedures in place to identify, respecting their rights. It was for less than 5 minutes. Aside from that, if it gets done, it gets reported all the way up to our medical director, our Women and Special Programs Administrator. There's a review conducted. We use alternative means. We do not restrain pregnant or postpartum females in our agency.
Thank you.
I believe that's the same answer for the United States Marshals Service. Because we have the pretrial folks, folks under prosecution. We also have the statute that required that to be stopped, and so we use alternative means.
Well, I would quote others who have said that that is barbaric, and I appreciate that that has been banned. Thank you very much. Thank you for your consideration.
Sure, and before I move to our last speaker, Mr. Washington, if you could confirm that in data, especially during transportation. Okay, if you could confirm it. You said you believed it wasn't the case, so I just wanted to know if you could confirm it, especially during transportation.
Yes, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you. Our final member is Representative Marshals Powell, and let me just say, Representative Klein had to leave to go back to his office, but he wanted to express to you, as do I, our joy in working with you over the last couple of years and the leadership that you've displayed here and in Congress, and we just want you to know how much you will be missed and do hope we see you again in the future.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Bass, and to all my colleagues in the committee. It's been the greatest honor to serve with all of you, even in the most contentious times, and I truly will carry these experiences with me, and I hope that we will all meet soon again after I'm done with serving here in the House of Representatives. Thank you so much, Chairwoman. Thank you to the witnesses for appearing this morning. It's such an important public health issue, but I wanted to just start setting the record straight and responding to some of the points that the ranking member has made. He continues to accuse Democrats of failing to keep our communities safe, and that is the farthest thing from the truth. It is actually Republicans and members like him who are trampling on the rule of law and trying to overturn the will of the people. Just yesterday, one of the president's attorneys called for Chris Krebs to be taken out and shot. Chris Krebs, the security official who Trump fired because he wouldn't go along with the lies from the administration, because he said that there was absolutely no evidence of fraud. It is the Democrats who are fighting to save lives during this pandemic. And it is the Democrats who are constantly trying to keep our communities safe and to save the lives of those who are incarcerated, because we realize that there is respect and dignity to every human life. Now, Director Carvajal, I sent you a letter with Representative Demings back in April. We have, in my district, we have one of the prison bureaus, FCI Miami. It's a low security facility that holds about 900 inmates and employs several hundred staff. 139 inmates at FCI Miami have tested positive for COVID-19, and unfortunately, we have lost one life there at that facility. So I would just urge you that you would make voluntary testing available to staff immediately. It is very difficult for them to travel long distances to get those tests, and it's not just for the safety of the inmates and the staff, it's also for the safety of our community here in Miami. Now, I wanted to turn quickly to another issue, and that's the deployment of the BOP teams to respond to the protests over the murder of George Floyd. In June, we received reports that showed that tactical BOP teams were sent to Washington, D.C. and Miami. The riot team sent to Miami sat in a hotel for a few days and left after the protests in Miami because they were nothing but peaceful. There were no federal buildings at risk. We didn't see any sort of violence. Director Carvajal, why were tactical BOP teams sent to Miami? If you can quickly answer that question.
Congresswoman, they were there only a few hours. We actually redirected them back to D.C., and yes, they were deployed.
And who made that decision, and what was the rationale for that?
As you know, Congresswoman, we're a component of the Department of Justice. The Attorney General of the Department of Justice requested assistance in the law enforcement mission. They called us. I made the decision after consulting with my leadership team to make sure that we could send a number of personnel, and we did.
And are these teams trained in civilian crowd control?
Congresswoman, they're trained in crowd control. It's actually what we do.
Okay, so I'm assuming that the Special Operations Response Teams received training on appropriate non-inmate crowd control since June.
We have a contingency plan and training in place to train for civil disturbances. That is non-prison type disturbances. We train our personnel and our tactical teams in just that.
Okay, thank you. And Director Washington, since June 2020, how many times have BOP agents or employees being deputized as U.S. Marshals?
Since June of 2020, I don't recall any BOP agents being deputized as U.S. Marshals.
Okay, so when, yeah, go ahead.
If I may assist there, our personnel who were deployed are deputized by United States Marshals. It was done on site before they ever took to the patrolling. That was done because by statute, our arrest authority is limited in the BOP, and anytime we're deployed, we often deploy, it just doesn't get media attention. We respond to most every major national disaster out there. Our staff are always deputized before they go out on patrol.
And let me ask you something that I saw. Some of the BOP personnel were concealing their identities by removing their name tips and other identifying badges. Who directed them to do this, and what was the purpose of that?
Congressman, I'd like to correct the record. I appreciate you asking me that question. No one was instructed to remove anything. I got asked that question during a virtual press conference, and I answered it very bluntly. I failed to properly mark our people because we deployed in such a quick manner. We don't usually worry about that. Having an institution marker on you doesn't mean nothing in a major city if you don't know what that prison's located. We did correct that immediately. Within 2 days, we appropriately marked all our staff, and there is a standardized marking for them now.
Well, I thank you for that, Director Carvajal, because we actually did see that federal agents were unidentified, and it poses a risk to the safety, to the overall safety of our community. So I do hope that you hold those that did that and did not follow the appropriate procedures accountable. And thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Before we adjourn, I just want to say, one, I want to thank you again, both of our witnesses, for coming today. Let me thank you for taking the time to come, and let me also thank you for your work. And in addition to raising concerns, again, we want to know how we can best help you. We would have liked to have done a second panel. If we had done a second panel, I would have invited Dante Westmoreland, who was sentenced to 7 years in Kansas. It was a first-time marijuana charge, and ironically, if he had been from California, what he had done would not have even been a crime. In fact, he could have opened up his own business. I want to say that public safety is safety from violence, but also safety from COVID in terms of the general community. And my concern is both for the inmates, but also the staff. The staff are dying as well, not just the inmates. And so reducing the prison population safely protects the health and safety of inmates and the general community. And that we will continue to call, as it says in the memo, we further urge you to assess the risk of contracting COVID-19 of every individual in BOP custody. And with that, this concludes today's hearing, and we adjourn.